Oh, wait, sorry, was my mic not on? Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Felicity, AF first, pronoun she, her.
David speaking second, no preferred gender pronouns.
Hi, I'm Wei. I'm after gender pronouns she, her too.
Wonderful. And negative. First negative.
Yeah, hi. Leader of opposition, Rashid Keegan.
Adele speaking second.
Abhishek speaking third.
Okay, wonderful. I thank all speakers for introducing themselves. Speaking time is 8 minutes. I ask you all to please time yourselves. And at 8:15, the panel will no longer be listening or taking notes what you're saying. I recommend that you just kind of finish your sentence and then sit back down after that. Without any further ado, I welcome the first affirmative to open the debate.
Am I both visible and audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Cool. Time starts now. The illusion that more is better has systematically prevented us from making any meaningful change against climate change, drowning island cities and hurtling us towards a trajectory of extinction. For the most meaningful and efficient method, affirm. In this speech, I'll do some setup, then two substantives. On the setup, first, what will minilateralism policies look like? It's likely going to look like the most affected nations being engaged in discussions to climate issues. For example, instead of people waiting on refugees, the immediate affected countries like Fiji and Sri Lanka would discuss how to evacuate these climate refugees when their islands go underwater, or countries facing violation of volcanoes in the Pacific Ring of Fire will be the countries discussing problems and how relief allocation happens instead of the white countries. Or it looks like things that exist right now, like the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. The few countries that are particularly harmed, like Ghana and Bangladesh, receive billions from their partners and are able to substantially reduce their pollutant-related diseases. By combating it through minilateralism, it means that countries will engage in bilateral agreements to reduce the use of fossil fuels, have things like cap and trade schemes for CO2, and deals will be between these countries, and not between countries that are not involved or have no stake in the matter. These agreements can be divided along several ways, for example, through different regions or different industries. A key characterization here is that global agreements will grow less and less effective and are counterproductive with the effort of dealing with climate change, which we'll mechanize later. But that's why even though the current UN Sustainable Development Goals work to some extent, others like the Paris Agreement or COP21 have largely failed. Our first substantive is that minilateralism is more effective in producing sustainable and long-term change for the climate crisis. The thesis of this argument is that current global agreements fail and will become increasingly complex in the future, and minilateralism negotiations are crucial for making policies possible. The framing for this argument first is that global agreements and the status quo don't work for three reasons. A, that global agreements take too long because it involves way too many countries that have very, very different interests and oftentimes contradictory objectives and existing grudges specifically related to climate change oftentimes. So it's really hard to reach a consensus. For example, you would never see Russia and the US agreeing to work with each other because they're afraid that the other country might steal its data or something. But policies are also too watered down. For example, the Paris Agreement relies on countries doing things on their own generally. There's no enforcement. There's no way it actually succeeds. B, there's no political will, and therefore there's a lack of buy-in. Since it's so global, you don't feel beholden to it or trust it. You can also view it as a colonial instrument. That's especially true for countries in the developing world where they produce the most waste. That's crucial because those countries, the most instrumental ones, will have the least will to act. But C, there's no urgency because negotiating global agreements take many, many years. Every single time you make a small change, everyone needs to vote on it again. Everyone gets angry, and a consensus can't be reached until a really long period of time passes. passes. If nothing is done immediately, countries are facing the consequences right now because the risks of climate change really need you to act fast. For example, entire nations drowning in the next few decades and places that are already being destroyed by floods, millions of climate refugees every single year. The second layer under this argument is why it's going to be less and less effective into the future. That's for 3 reasons. A, the global community is increasing. The climate change between different countries means different things. It's very unfair for them to be legislating over one another. Again, you can't expect countries with polar opposite interests to agree. But B, there's also increasing complexity because as the number of countries involved increases, it's harder to manage since climate change is also getting worse and affecting more and more countries, which means that there's also going to be more problems to solve. But C, the scope is so large and the geopolitical landscape is getting so varied that you can't really enforce it and review it logistically when there's 190 countries involved. That means that's crucial because it's not just a mechanism for why global agreements are bad right now, but a mechanism for why it's going to get worse and worse into the future. The third layer under this argument is why multilateralism is more effective. A, there's more buy-in. Countries now feel like they have a say. You feel like your vote actually matters as a small island country because there's only a few countries per agreement instead of 190 countries. Countries are going to become a lot more invested in the process because they feel important and that their preferences actually matter. But B, these agreements will be very tailored and effective. For example, green bonds or clean energy projects only happen when you can address specific needs of every single country involved in something that's so vague that it does nothing. On our side, we get something precise and targeted. But C, the very intuitive mechanism, it's going to be a lot faster because it's a lot less complex and generally countries with the same area have the same interests. For example, countries in the same place would care about an oil spill because it affects all of them. There are 3 main impacts here. Firstly, there's substantially more buy-in from countries when it comes to solving these issues. A, you can implement policies that you're actually comfortable with and therefore have a lot more incentive to comply with and support. But B, there's no longer the excuse that they're not invested in the global community and therefore don't need to follow these agreements or have incentive to actually comply. This is important because they fail to get buy-in because there's no compliance or enforcement mechanisms. For example, COP21, the only way to actually get a sustainable incentive is if you give them an independent, selfish incentive to do so, which only we can get on our side. But secondly, the second impact is that these policies are more effective. In some countries enforcing hydroelectricity, you can't force them to work in barren countries, but in multilateral agreements, they can share the information about what is best for their region specifically. That can't happen on a large scale where the solutions are too broad. The third impact is that even if we get less buy-in, our policies actually work to reduce CO2, which can only happen when it's tailored to the country itself. But I also just want to note that this defense about why it's never going to work is independent offense because of a resource trade-off, which means you're always preferring AFON here. On the weighing, firstly, multilateralism as a strategy is the best way to reduce climate change impacts on the poor. For example, incoming famine, which is extremely important because it harms most vulnerable. But second, even if multilateralism only works for some countries, it's better that they work at all instead of shoehorning these global agreements that no one will agree to or actually comply with, even if they do agree to it. For example, India refusing to work with Russia because they don't want Russia to steal their technology or data, or US not wanting to become vulnerable to competition. But the third layer of weighing here is that it works with the most important countries. The countries that get alienated have no say in refugees and green energy because they're the most poor. But conversely, because they're the most poor, they're also the most vulnerable. They're the ones that matter the most and need to contribute and need to be in these solutions. Our second substantive is that global agreements worsen climate change. The thesis here is that the existence of poorly enforced mechanisms enables these polluting countries to shield themselves, exacerbating these issues. The first mechanization here is that it creates loopholes, for example, outsource pollution to avoid sanctions. That's when countries actually export their CO2 emissions to other countries, for example, Canada to India. When developed countries have a large say, it allows them to stimulate consumption and speed up pollution in developing countries, even if the pollution in their own countries decreases. But second, it stymies grassroots movements because politicians can hide behind global agreements to say that they've already done a lot. But third, in the rare cases where they're effective at imposing sanctions, these regulations are overly harsh on developing countries. These developing countries don't have the expertise that developed countries have. It actually damages and slows down their economy. Countries have to reverse climate-friendly policy or switch to even worse alternatives because now their economy is so bad that they can't transition out of industrialization. Because we're the only chance of solving, and their side actively makes things worse, affirm.
Thank you very much to the first affirmative speaker, and I now welcome the first negative to open the negative case.
Hi, Bill Invisible.
Yep, you are.
Okay, I assume so. Oh, cool. Just give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the info slide in this motion says that it's most polluting countries that are often the most affected by this, which means at the end of the day, the policy the government side is going for is the cat watching over the cream. In that, countries with the highest emissions are the ones that are going to sit in a room and go ahead and set themselves in the majority of cases, right? We tell you that this is particularly problematic, not only because of the things that they identify themselves, right? The fact that enforcement mechanisms are hard for you to establish in the first place because nobody has an incentive to go ahead and create frameworks that hold themselves accountable, right? If they are the only ones in that particular agreement. Which is why we're telling you that the biggest, the two big things that we bring to you from opposition is that we're able to increase the efficiency in reducing the effects of climate change by ensuring that we have better enforcement mechanisms and analyzing the interests of various partners. But secondly, we'll also talk about how we can aid developing countries better in order to adjust to changing into a green economy and to bear with the effects of climate change that often end up happening. Before that, quick bits of rebuttal, right? Even if you do want to talk about developing countries like Sri Lanka going ahead and making agreements together, we don't really understand where they will get their resources from, which is why global agreements are a thing. When the United States goes ahead and gives you aid money, they get something in return in terms of trade or more favorable deals with respect to natural resources. That is why we think that these agreements work. We're not sure where you're going to get the money from for all your refugees and everything that you want to do. Secondly, look at the lack of delta in their case, right? The United States, China, and India are still the major polluters and need to come together to make the most tax agreements on their side of the house too, which means hard negotiations are anyways going to happen even on their side of the world. The only difference is that you also have regional blocks on our side, like the Southeast Asian bloc, the Central African bloc, which come and talk about their interest in terms of what they need as subsidies for, say, hydroelectricity in Central Africa, like solar energy in Southeast Asia and things like that, in order to go and ensure that their interests are also represented in that particular discussion forum, right? Which means, sure, there is a slight increase in the delay in which these deals are made on our side of the house, but we don't think there are 100 different countries talking about 100 different interests. You often can summarize them into smaller blocks. So certainly in terms of enforcement mechanisms, right? And this is just confusing for me because currently in the status quo itself, there are a significant number of enforcement mechanisms that have been effective. You can't just cherry pick examples and tell that, oh no, these don't work, right? At the point at which countries within that agreement prioritize trade with other members that go ahead and actually follow the regulations that were set up and reduce the amount of emissions. When you have systems like green central banking, a declared ECB policy in the recent years, which go ahead and give money for green technology and prioritize cheaper loans for these countries. When you go ahead and stop the import from excessively polluting industries from certain nations, damaging that particular industry and forcing them to go ahead and change. These are things that are already existing in terms of mechanisms, right? Because we think that most countries opt into this agreement because they want to prevent pollution at some point or the other, because it hurts their own citizens their own economy in some way or the other, which is why they want those enforcement mechanisms to also be there in the first place, right? If they're a part of the agreement and they don't enforce the agreement on other members, it's the worst possible case for them, right? Because they are the ones that pay the economic cost of climate policies, and they don't benefit from others going ahead and actually following, like reducing the emissions, which is why we tell you that every nation also has an incentive to go ahead and like have these enforcement policies in the first place. Later in my speech about why we can get these in a much better way if you have a global agreement. Firstly, in terms of efficacy in climate change prevention, why are we better? Let's look at opt-in, right? On which side of the house do we think more number of countries will be there and there'll be like more effective action? We think that there'll be a collective action problem side of the house. At the point at which most part of the world is not a part of this agreement, you don't want to screw over your economy for some small gain, right? You want to see most of the world going ahead and making those hard choices and making those hard trade-offs of shutting down factories, spending extra money and making electricity costlier for people at the cost of it coming from green sources. And only when you see the rest of the world doing that, do you have any incentive to do it, right? If not, there is no political will for you to buy into that in the first place. This is because it looks politically weak at the point at which no politician wants to go out there and be like, I am the one that is hurting the very people that voted me and want to like combat climate change for this particular reason. And also in terms of practicality, right? Because regulating the polluting industries in your own country puts it at a competitive risk at the point at which all of these policies make them significantly expensive, the kind of products that come out of these industries in the first place, right? Which means your economy also gets hurt significantly without any kind, like not just in terms of the cost you spend to transition those industries, but also the fact that those industries stop being competitive in the first place, right? Which means on their side of the house, there is absolutely no incentive for nations, even if it's like a lesser in number, to come together and make this change in the first place, right? But second, when you look at countries that are not the most polluting, but still developed in nature, which are often like European nations and slightly richer nations in other parts of the world, they're able to offer better terms for developing countries to actually get them to sign, right? Because that is the biggest contention that's there in most deals, which will probably happen on their side of the house too. Without money from the developed world, countries like India and China are refusing to transition to clean energy. Only when you increase the pool of money that is available for these nations to use, we think that you can lure them into this in the first place. But sadly, less emitting countries are also particularly important to opt in, right? Because regulations on them incentivize their governments and industries, especially again European nations, to invest more into research into green alternatives, which can later trickle down into emitting countries too. Which means we think that there's not only better opt in, but like better incentive to opt in, but when certain nations opt in, you get better terms of the deal for everyone, which means everyone has an incentive to be a part of this, right? But secondly, let's look at the interests of different parties to this agreement. Why do we think we better suit them in a global agreement? As we told you earlier, when emitting countries are the ones that set the limits for themselves, it's off the cat watching over the cream. They want to continue emitting for the growth of their economies, especially nations like India, China, like United States, where India is trying to fill in a manufacturing gap after like factories are moving away from China, and the US and China are caught in a global war to become like the world's biggest superpower to begin with, right? Both like economically and militarily on some levels, which means they obviously want to have the economic advantage and don't want to give these things up that easily to begin with, right? Which means they're likely to oppose policies that reduce emissions. The countries that emit less actually have an incentive to get into that deal and push for climate-friendly policies and like climate-friendly policies, right? Because these nations also understand the harm of going ahead and damaging the climate, and they also are larger in number, which means they can offer things like collective benefits that like United States and China and India can use on a later level, right? That you can trade with our bloc if you go ahead and reduce the kind of emissions that you have. You can get exclusive deals with us when you do these things. Those are absent on their side of the house. But more importantly, we tell you that less emitting countries include many nations that are also extremely vulnerable to go ahead and like climate change in the first place, right? Small countries and islands that are suffering from floods. We think that their interests need to be absolutely represented because of the fact that the pollution by developed nations is what brought them here. And finally, in terms of abilities and enforcement mechanisms, right? Because nations in Europe are often the richer ones, and also slightly less polluting, and have invested a lot of money to transition to a green economy, they often have more soft power in nation in like various international organizations and the ability to enforce, an ability to create much more powerful enforcement mechanisms which do not exist on their side of the house, when it's just 10 nations in an agreement. For all those reasons, vote opposition.
Thank you very much to the first negative, and now I call the second affirmative to continue this debate.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, you're good.
Okay,
Excuse me, can you just wait for a second because our second speaker got disconnected? They'll join
can indeed
back
wait.
in a second.
so hope everyone's having a good day. I, for one, am having an awful week.
I mean, we had to stay up all night in India to debate, so I'll
Well,
be doing that for the rest of
that is a cope. You guys signed up for this tournament.
the day.
There's not much to be done there.
Yeah.
Are we good? Oh, yes. Double thumbs up. Great. Okay, I'll proceed. Yeah. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to really win the incentives debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some of the marginal impacts in terms of perception, buy-in, and then I'm going to blow those up so hard that they also become a debate Op has to engage with. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the future and enforcement. First, the incentives debate. The main responsive push from opposition is that most polluting countries don't have an incentive to do this because they don't see other countries doing it now that the scope of the minilateral tool has, narrowed. First response, those countries will never agree to do it because they still pollute substantially less. So it's not as if this incentive works for either side, because on opposition, right, the countries that would eventually be legislated harshly by these things, but are not as heavily polluters, would also be heavily harmed, even though they don't do as much harm. So it's not like they would agree, which means that on your side, you would never get to an agreement in the first place. So at minimum, this incentive doesn't do anyone for anything in this debate. Secondly, though, is that the reason for why minilateralism is persuasive towards these countries is because we get their direct competitors. Guess what? Other large polluters that have high emissions levels within the agreement, which is why minilateralism is so important, because it bundles together these game theoretic incentives. Thirdly, though, on the other hand, without minilateralism, these countries don't have enough of a say in the global agreement where their say is watered down. So the game theoretic fear of being excluded and losing out due to the negotiations is worse when they have a comparatively less say in the nature of the agreements. So on your side, they never opt in, much worse. Fourthly and finally is that global agreements still suffer from a game theoretic distrust that op never solves, which is even if everyone says they will stop polluting, there's no way of actually knowing that they will stop. Like the US can pay lip service to it and then build factories in the Midwest anyway. The only logistically feasible way to assuage the game theoretic fears of these countries that op claims is to feasibly logistically check them through minilateralism, which is the only way that you could actually have the enforcement mechanism succeed. So on these 4 responses, the first part of the incentives debate on their specific mechanism is won by us. So it's turned on the impact. And so we have a much stronger case actually, now that they've built that point. The second thing, though, I want to add in the incentives debate is that the global community is especially bad when it comes to legislating these types of agreements. There are 4 reasons why. Number one is that many countries in the global community that don't have such high emissions levels are less concerned by the immediate urgency that climate change faces, which means that they may be focused more on short-term economic growth and job creation instead of long-term sustainable environmental change, particularly if they're not experiencing the most severe impacts of climate change. Secondly, is that many of these countries may perceive climate action as a burden on their economy, as a threat to their competitiveness, much more than the countries that actually have them as their industry, because they benefit from cheap polluting products from other countries, like electronics from China produced at great cost to the environment, or the semiconductors that the Philippines sells to Taiwan and other countries in ASEAN. So what ends up happening is actually countries that are less involved comparatively benefit more in the cost-benefit calculus. Thirdly, is that other countries in the global community may just simply prioritize other issues or concerns over climate change, such as national security or foreign policy considerations, which drastically slows down the discussions and agenda formation. But fourthly and finally, is that they just have political or ideological objections to climate action, such as a skepticism of environmental regulations or a preference for free market solutions, which means even if on opposition, right, sometimes the incentives of the minilateral countries are imperfect, it is substantially better than the more watered down, less urgent, and in fact perverse incentives of the broader global community. The third thing I'm going to do in this incentives debate is to constructively prove why, in fact, the countries that pollute the most, or that is to say, the countries with the highest emission levels, are in the best position to start doing these changes. So why is that the case? The first and easiest reason why is that these countries simply face the largest impact or the largest consequence of it. That is, one, they are the most vulnerable to the direct impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, and food and water scarcity. This is due to a variety of structural reasons, like the countries that pollute the most ends up, experiencing the most proximate impacts to like having, massive landfills or having oil spills in the ocean. But also in addition to that, these effects tend to concentrate in these areas. Secondly, is that they may face the most severe economic and social costs of climate change, such as damage to infrastructure, loss of agricultural productivity, because their industries rely on these things. Thirdly, is that they may face the most pressure from citizens and the international community to take on action for that climate change, as public awareness and concern about the issue that they're particularly doing continues to grow. But fourthly, is that they also have the most to gain from transitioning to a low carbon economy, such as new economic opportunities. They will prospectively have the most jobs than already partly transitioned economies. Beyond that, the comparative is that they face the greatest risk of being left behind in the global transition to a low carbon economy. Hence, the countries within the minilateral agreement have 4 strong and immense positive incentives to change this, but these changes get watered down by other countries outside that. Why is it so effective then that we win this debate? First of all, is that this incentives debate shows that forcing these changes through global agreements takes substantially more time when the countries that are most affected by these policies already have strong incentives and have a massive potential for good that we could use to concentrate in affecting and benefiting these countries. But when opposition forces it to go through global agreements, they don't work. When you have it through exclusive minilateralism, that's when you're best able to get the most tailored solutions to their needs, and you're best able to get the most effective, urgent, and rapid-fire solutions to their needs. That's why in ASEAN, it was from the ASEAN specifically and not the global fucking community that you saw trillions of dollars invested in green bonds, because they realized the haze over Malaysia and the haze over Indonesia is going to fly over my head in Manila, is going to fly over the heads of people in Timor-Leste and Sri Lanka and so on. So it's these changes that are most effective, and they are faced most proximately by the people that would be spoken over by the global international community. That ends the first debate, and we on about 4 different accounts. So I guess we can split the incentives debate into 4 issues. We win all of them. So 1 times 4 is a lot of numbers. It's 4. Okay. So the second argument, I can't believe I said that. The second argument is that you also just get substantially more resources and capacitated, even if you have relatively less buy-in and you somehow have relatively less support. So the reason for why you have more power to do effective change is, first of all, is that the policies are themselves just substantially better, right? Like they're more tailored to the individual actions, which means that there's actually less of an economic cost on countries themselves. If this economy is so vital to the country, or this industry is so vital to the country, then you won't target changes specifically there, but instead mitigating the effects of that. And you're only able to specifically target it to their needs once you're able to learn about the context of these countries and you're able to share information between countries in the similar region. So what ends up happening actually is the most effective changes that are low cost can only be implemented and even discovered or researched on government bench. So that's the first way we get free benefits. The second way is we just get more money. This is an assertion from opposition that we get less money somehow. Actually, there are 5 structural reasons why we get more money. Number 1, by focusing on a smaller group of countries, minilateral agreements can allow for more targeted and effective use of financial resources, which means we're not spreading these resources resources too thin, we can maximize impacts by using economies of scale and by specifically concentrating them in certain countries. Secondly, many agreements can provide a greater sense of ownership and investment among participating countries, which widens the pool of resources and helps foster greater commitment in the first place. The trust leads to more investment. Thirdly, is that the countries that are part of a minilateral agreement are more likely to provide financial support to one another because they are increasingly linked by these minilateral agreements. So there's an incentive for them to want each other to succeed. Fourthly, is that private sector actors are more likely to invest in these countries that are part of a minilateral agreement because the agreement provides a stable and predictable regulatory environment for climate policies and investments, whereas these global agreements aren't nearly strong enough to create that stable regulatory environment for people to invest and for people to grow the economy. But 15, finally, is that donor countries and international financial institutions are more willing to provide financial support to countries that are part of a minilateral agreement because one, is just more likely to be effective, so they believe it's good, so they'll be able to do it there. But secondly, is that the faster it happens, the more likely they are to continue getting cheap products from countries within this area. This all shows that we get one, more effective enforcement mechanisms, and two, we are much more likely to get the resources to actually do these policies in the first place, and three, is that we get better policies which are more effective per dollar. The only point they have here is to say there are some enforcement mechanisms that are effective after saying like green central bank and then not explaining it, other than the fact that it's an example for our side, since it's a group of small countries like the European community deciding where to distribute and allocate money. The most successful cases of enforcement mechanism are precisely when it's logistically feasible, when it's done by people that share these incentives, and when they benefit one another. You can probably respond to this in your speech, but I've done so much material, you have to do like 16 minutes of response, and by then my GovWhip have spoken. So this debate is already lost from opposition bench. Affirm.
Thank you very much to second affirmative for their speech, and I now invite second negative to continue this debate.
Amenable.
Yes.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The nice thing about debating is because we don't just count points, but actually look at how they interject, I don't really need 16 minutes of rebuttal to take down David's speech. Here's the thing. Look at all of the government's impacts, and you will notice that they all derive from one link that if we take down their case. All of this, starting from the assumption that they have significantly more collaboration and faster reaching agreements on their side. This is where they drag from. This is why we will get more opt-in, because when you have faster agreements, it feels more effective. And this is why we will have more ability to actually promote climate and environmentally friendly policies, yada, yada, yada. Look at this. All of this comes down from this link. Here's why this link falls. A, already coming in Harshit and getting no response. What is their delta in terms of lack of collaboration? We know that the 4 most emitting economies are China, the US, India, and Russia. Can I think of 4 more conflicted countries with less shared incentives? It would be quite difficult. I think the main issue with government here is they generalize and just assert that emitting countries is 1-to-1 correlation with just developing countries. Not how it works, fellas. The biggest correlatory factor to emissions is the size of the population, because the bigger countries and the bigger economies also have the most industries that pollute the most. This is why the US is not quite a developing country, albeit their politics sometimes look like it, but they are polluting quite significantly. Note how this also takes down the framing of these countries have shared incentives and can therefore tailor the policies to what's best for them and what is the geographical spill between them if there's an oil spill. I don't know which oil spill spans between the US and China. I think that a lot of the countries involved really don't share much in geography or in interests quite a bit. Just on this factual framing, I think quite a bit of government falls. Secondly, if anything, it is easier to reach agreement when you have more of the other countries with less emissions involved, because these other countries do have a common interest. They are all similarly interested in reducing emissions because other countries are emitting and they are not benefiting from it, but everyone pays the cost. What does it mean? That when we have all of these countries be part of the agreement, they can form coalitions and lobby and pressure the policies that they favor inside. They can also use mechanisms that Harshit already explained in his speech to incentivize the other countries in the bloc to agree to them, such as literally helping them subsidize the transition. David says that the reason why countries don't want to opt in easily is because this will make an economic cost on them. True, this is why we help them. This is why most of the agreements that we have on climate change are actively subsidizing the transition of the industry. We also create a shared incentive by fixing the collective action problem. David says, no, the collective action problem isn't fixed because countries that are stronger economies are still harmed less by the regulation. This is missing on the nuance of our economic analysis. The point isn't my economy gets fucked, so I want others to get fucked. We don't think countries are kindergarten kids. We think that what is more likely is that specific regulations, such as capping the percentage of pollution that a factory is allowed to do, are regulations that limit certain corporations from working in your country. Meaning that if you do them, but other countries in the world don't, companies are likely to relocate, leave your country, and move to others. This has nothing to do with strong versus weak economies. It just means that the incentive is that everyone regulates, because if only I regulate, my economy uniquely gets fucked. At this point already, we think government is in a problematic situation. I would also note, we think that this collaboration, even if they were to prove it, is just less important than our point on the incentives to create good policies. The more David analyzes why the countries that pollute care less about the long-term impacts of climate change and more about the short-term impacts of their economy, the more he agrees and strengthens our point that this is the cat watching over the cream. We don't want these agreements to be some virtue signaling nice. We are all showing that we care about the environment. The opt-in only matters insofar as it is opt-inning to something that is meaningful. If they are going to have the most lax regulations that actually fix nothing, then I don't care that more countries are opting in or collaborating, even if they were to win this point. And we think that under our side, we do create an incentive for them to collaborate. Let's repeat some of the enforcement mechanisms we said that government seems to miss. A, how do agreements even work? These are usually directly tied to trade agreements, aka we prioritize countries within these agreements in our trade negotiations. This is part of the Paris Agreement. Secondly, when all of the member countries that did opt into this agreement are already agreeing on a regulation, it will have to also impact the countries that are more emitting. Why? Because if the EU is part of an agreement to regulate what kind of produce they are allowed to produce and the amount of pollution that is allowed to be done when creating it, it impacts import. It means that they will not import from China if the Chinese produce is produced in a manner that is significantly polluting, because this is against their own agreements. This is how you're able to have an enforcement mechanism. It is a de facto sanction on trade. Thirdly, yes, green central banking. Yes, we know the ECB has done it, and the ECB is a local agreement. Cool story, bro. Two issues. A, local agreements can exist on our side as well. No one prevents blocks to also, in addition to the global agreements, create their own regulations and policies, which is exactly why the ECB does it in addition to the Paris Agreement. But B, we think that green central banking is already being promoted farther and has been recently actively considered by the IMF, which we think a lot of countries that government cares about are likely to care about significantly. Cool. Let's then go back to our constructive. Other than showing to you that we have better policies to actually fight climate change, we think we also help the developing countries that government cares about so much more, both because many of them are direct victims of climate change, and we contest the claim that this is only a long-term effect that they don't already feel and care about. Many of them are experiencing natural disasters as we speak. They have less resources to actually fight against these crises, build dams, and so on. Many of them are small countries on island states, which are very, very vulnerable to floods. We think that they are very significantly harmed by this. But secondly, on economic incentives as well. When you are part of a global agreement, which includes the entirety of the EU and many other less polluting but richer countries, they are then able and incentivized to A, subsidize your transition, helping you in the process of swallowing the economic costs in the short term, B, collaborate on technological adjustments and allowing you the use of their green tech solutions, C, creating more green tech solutions in the first place, because the fact that the EU is also part of these agreements means that these regulations inside them incentivize their own industries to develop greener technologies, which later on trickle down into the developing economies and allow them to adjust their economies accordingly as well. Fourthly, also collaboration on efforts to handle the active harms of climate change. The UN actually sent humanitarian aid to countries that are member of these agreements. Beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much to the second negative speaker, and I now call the third affirmative to conclude the affirmative bench.
Am I both visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. Tim will start on my first word. Even if you buy everything they say in this entire debate, realize that their entire case is uncomparative. They talk about having no incentive for big countries to work together. That incentive doesn't work on either side. The crucial delta in this debate is that we have active, sustainable, and selfish incentives for people to compete with each other in the same block in the agreement. And major polluters in the same region have the active incentive to solve their own problems, and that is where we win the debate. I'm going to channel in one major clash on who gets better and faster deals, because I think that's where the crux of the debate is. The only thing they said is that only relevant nations and like high polluter nations are going to be engaged, and that the complexity of passing policies are symmetric. Firstly, we told you it's the same thing. The countries that are the major polluters are the ones that are the most affected. David mechanizes that to you. They tell you that countries aren't affected by the same oil spill. Obviously, that's not the mechanism. Our mechanism was that when you are polluting a country, you obviously have a lot of incentive to fix that pollution because you yourself are suffering from oil spills that are happening right next to you. But also, we literally limited to region and industry in our model, which they didn't respond to at all. That's so important because it means that all of our mechanisms from CASE still apply. Crucially, remember that we're not forcing US and China to work together from the opposite side of the world. We're asking that two countries in Asia or the Pacifics, for example, are able to work together. Secondly, mineralateralism is smaller, so includes less countries, and it targets bigger countries in that smaller group, which creates the incentive that we benefit from. So again, our mechanisms still apply. But third, this debate isn't only about large countries, so don't be limited by like CAP's info slide, because the debate would be pretty boring that way. It's also about policies between smaller unions like EU that want to like turn to green tech, which like they literally gave us an example of, or nations who have a lack of water because like someone's irrigating too much on a river. In those important cases, there are common interests for nations to act to that probably won't work on a global scale. But firstly, note that it's not symmetric because there's a lot less complexity when there is not literally 190 nations needing to reach a consensus. The bargaining power of smaller nations increases exponentially when there are less nations as a whole because like they get access to a larger amount of the pie. Like because in global treaties, like Fiji's votes only account for 1/190, but in minimalist negotiations, they get like 1/10 of the votes. Moreover, larger nations like the US are able to leverage their allies into voting in favor of them. Like when US cannot leverage those votes because a lot of the nations are not engaged in those minimalist treaties in the first place, it's a lot fairer for the actual smaller nations that are being affected. But finally, the nature of mineralateralism being smaller and more regional is really important here. The responses from DLO rely heavily on the US being bad and domineering, but this is still true for global agreements. That this doesn't happen when everyone has their own unilateral agreement. So maybe the US can fuck over Canada and Mexico, but at least North Africa is fine, for example. So at their best, I think their entire case is at best a wash, because if no one reaches consensus on either side, I don't get why they're better anyways. Where will our funding come from? Because like that's the major question they ask. Like they say that you need funding from US and EU to like build seawalls or have like better trickle down technology, for example. Firstly, you don't necessarily rely on the US and EU to build seawalls. Like the US literally never does that. It's just factually untrue because larger nations have the active incentive to make developing nations weaker so they become less competitive. So you don't know where the entire case of like US and China helping out smaller nations comes from. It's institutions like the UN or World Bank or the IMF that they talked about that helps with things like climate mitigation, and those institutions have the incentive to provide aid either way. But secondly, wow, our money can come from rich polluters because there's more pressure from everyone on larger nations within these minimalist negotiations. But David also gave you 5 reasons why money is spread over less and countries are likely to help each other out, etc. And that is why there's more funding and more better funding for technology under our side. But thirdly, it doesn't always have to be money, but also things like green tech that people are far more likely to invest in under our side because these policies are specifically tailored for specific actors by people who understand those actors. This looks like instead of setting the same global carbon cap for everyone in the world, nations around Japan create a specific policy for Japan to deal with their nuclear plant leaks. So that is why we don't get developing nations that fall into recession because overly harsh regulations that eventually fail, and like developing nations that want to like go into the loopholes of the Paris Agreement and outsource to like India or China. And I think that is why like trickle down technology and also like more funding is what happens under side proposition. Their criticism of the link, like their claim that most collaborating countries will be bad and belligerent is untrue. First, most of our claims are actually not reliant on the DLO vibes on collaboration. There are a series of game theory incentives and moneyed incentives that can only emerge when the group of countries have the discussion can logistically be enforced. But first, we set up this debate so that it's most polluting in the region or the industry. So it's not just the US. That's why we gave examples of affected countries in the Pacific Island states or the Pacific Rim. But secondly, more polluting countries can per capita, which is an obvious fact claim that is equally valid. But third, if the US is bad, then giving them a better incentive to actually implement like climate policy is good. Look at the example of the climate pledges and agreements that the US refused to ratify, and like Paris Agreement or like UN treaties, and that is why like global agreements are unlikely to work. Our agreements are more likely to work both on the incentive level and play out for 4 reasons. Firstly, there's more buy-in because it's likely that nations affected by the impact of climate change or the environmental problems near them have the active incentive to solve problems together. But secondly, policies are specifically tailored for nations involved considering their interests in social dynamic. So there aren't policies like Paris Agreement that nations can find loopholes in by outsourcing to other developing nations or having like the developing world be put into recession because of strict restrictions. But thirdly, I think quite intuitively, it happens a lot faster because there's less actors. So like there's less interest that you have to care about, and there's also less leveraging of other nations, i.e. like US trying to leverage, I don't know, like Saudi Arabia or something into voting in favor for the US. You don't have those actors involved. But fourthly, you're more likely to have grassroots movements that are successfully initiated by people who are affected by, as example, heat strokes in summer or cold in the winter. Because under our side, polluter nations cannot say, oh, I'm in the Paris Agreement, so I did something and I don't need to improve anymore. They can't hide behind their curtains anymore under side F. And that is something that like OP never engages in. So even if we take them at their best and say like negotiations aren't going to pass, at least we have better grassroots movements that are also, for example, able to lobby the government or bring social mobility under our side. That is the point in which change is much more likely to happen, or at least happens a lot faster, which is super important. Because firstly, pretty obviously, you don't want people dying from climate change. But secondly, like also weigh this on urgency, because every day it takes to pass a regulation, there's millions of people dying from floods or dying from heat strokes that's solved under our side. But also, ELO seems to be under the assumption that blocks, under the assumption that everything is symmetric and like blocks exist under both sides, and large like countries don't want to collaborate under both sides. But I think like even at their best, their entire push is at best a wash, because like the same incentives apply to either side. If what they say is true, then they can't access their own impacts either. And for all those reasons, because we bring more effective change, we also give you better analysis in terms of incentive and how smaller nations get a much larger piece of the pie and bargaining power, that it's a clear AF-win.
Thank you very much to third affirmative, and I now invite the third negative to conclude the debate.
Okay. One second. Yeah. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're good.
Sure. Just give me around 30 seconds. Okay. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. When this debate is entirely an exercise in finding out what is symmetric and what is not. Let's first observe the case from side affirmative. It relies on two planks. One, that countries facing the same problem can probably collectivize together and solve those problems together. This probably looks like Sri Lanka and Fiji, who probably are suffering from floodings, or let's say other countries, let's say in Southeast Asia, who are suffering from cyclones, etc. The large gaping hole in this analysis is that they never prove to you why exactly they have enough shared interests that they will be let's say, communicating with each other, despite, let's say, certain distances existing with these countries, able to form the shared economies or economies of scale. But B, do they have enough resources in of themselves to solve those problems by themselves? Or do they actually rely, let's say, the help of developed nations who have sufficient resources to spare to actually go ahead and help them? I don't think they resolve that. The second prong is that, look, you know what, developed countries now, without having, let's say, many other parties involved, can come to much faster conclusions in terms of what these trade agreements look like, which once again goes entirely unresponsive. Three basic ideas from us. One, at the point of time, you're probably making these agreements at a very fast pace. It also probably means that you have very lax regulations on yourself. You're probably having a situation where the cat is watching the creme, right? The biggest polluters are regulating themselves in a manner that allows them to get away with most of their atrocities. Not entirely sure how effective that is. Do they actually get any delta on it? Two, notice we identify to you who these nations are. They not at any instance tell us, well, let's say a Russia or a China, a USA or a China, or India or a China, or a USA or a Russia have sufficient incentives to be able to gather together at a table and fairly negotiate or come to faster conclusions. Because most of the benefits are reliant upon them getting these faster conclusions, especially when these countries have multiple geopolitical tensions, but using their own analysis, are probably skeptical of each other, of using this as an excuse of getting a technological edge over the other, actually able to come to these fast conclusions. I think then, let's observe our case and see whether or not we are guilty of the accusation that they make of us. Note over here, the symmetric part is that, look, countries have conflicting incentives. The non-symmetric part that we clearly seem to be both in first and second is that, look, at a point of time, you have multiple countries with shared incentives. They can form blocks and they can lobby within these global agreements. For example, if, let's say, the Southeast Asian region is facing cyclones, they can, even in this global forum, go ahead and say that we probably require more fund release for it. They can probably characterize for the same. Very similarly, in other regions, for example, let's say Northern African belt, wherein there are some issues in terms of the sinkage of land, you can probably collectivize and have a strong collaborative opinion over there. Two, there are multiple incentives existing for developed countries to go ahead and allow for these subsidies. Two main prongs over here. One, they probably want the support of these let's say, developing countries so that they can tune these bills to the way that they want to, so that we can have some more degree of manipulation of what the terms and agreements are. Upfront cost for them in terms of allowing for these measures substantially lower than the actual cost of, let's say, the cut downs that they potentially have to make, which then means it's a viable trade-off that they can actually go ahead and make. Uniquely on our side, we are getting at very enough collaboration and agreement to allow many of these countries which are resource poor to solve their own issues to have some ability to solve their issues. Now, let's move on to the main clashes in this debate. A few things over here. One is in terms of, let's say, hard negotiations and the entire idea of proposition in terms of them having a time scale advantage over us. Note over here, at a point of time, their entire idea about who these actors are in terms of developed countries goes unresolved. Unclear if they get any benefits in terms of being faster solvers and talking about our front of developed countries. In case we're talking about developing countries, I think there's a large problem in terms of the ability of these people, as in of them having the resources to solve these problems. I think they largely rely on making tailored solutions or economies of scale. It's unclear to what extent is it possible. What do these solutions collectively look like? For example, if you have climate change problems, if let's say you have natural disasters, what exactly the economy of scale you're creating? I think there's this vague, let's say, debate jargon thrown out by them as compared to actual analysis. On the second prompt, then, that you know what, the consensus that we get is, let's say, on our side, it's going to be very prolonged. Two ideas over here. The first is that I'm not entirely sure if we need to agree on everything on day one. In most issues, as let's say Hadar pointed out, one, in case you have local pressing issues, you still have the ability to create local blocks and solve those problems on our side. But second, many of these problems are solved in a cascading manner. When the Paris Agreement as a monolith does not pass, but you agree to different terms at different instances of time, which then means even if the entirety of the agreement is not passed on our side, at very least we can agree on many of, let's say, the non-contest issues, which probably looks like helping subsidizing green tech in developing countries, in terms of helping countries who are facing climate change issues, in terms of bare minimum cut downs on harmful exports, imports, etc. On our side of the house, even if let's say you haven't agreed on non-contentious issues, and you can get those as in if you're not agreeing on contentious issues, and still get the non-contentious issues passed and put into action. Next thing, I think there's a very gaping strategic hole on their side in terms of the ability of people to come into these agreements. When Hadar points out that, look, when certain countries opt into form an agreement, many of which it looks like cutting down on, let's say, industry pollution levels, increasing, let's say, what all gases can be, as in decreasing the standard, increasing the filtration standards, banning imports, etc., that probably puts many of these developed countries at an economic disadvantage in terms of what their factories can produce. In the current global economy, especially talking about, for example, USA or Russia, in the US or China, they're very afraid of, let's say, factories moving from their country to other countries, right? The point from we do not have assurance that the developing countries are also not operating in the same conditions. They are probably afraid of capital flight and of, let's say, companies moving their bases from, let's say, US or China to other developing countries, maybe Taiwan, Bangladesh, or India, because it's much easier for them to produce the same goods over there. That point of time, when that is not resolved, very doubtful of the efficacy of any of the changes on their side. Finally, then, what is the bottom line on which you should judge this debate? It's largely the quality of human life and let's say, ability to counteract future measures. Firstly, on the broadest issue in this debate, which is the largest polluters make any substantial degree of change. I think even in the best case, when they say that they are going to get fast action, it's very likely these conditions are too lax and hence lax enough to not make have any delta in terms of change. On our side of the house, we are able to mechanize via, at least in terms of collaboration, you have some propensity of having stricter regulations on countries on at various non-contentious issues in terms of banning, let's say, certain polluting substances and things along those lines. And that happens on, let's say, a global scale as compared to maybe a few countries opting into their side. That is probably a clear benefit then on their side. On the other hand, if you're talking about developed countries, you're talking about issues that exist in the short term. I think when we say that we are probably solving it on a global level, we are able to provide these countries far more resources in, let's say, status quo or when we have global agreements than on their side when they're relying on these countries having similar issues, solving them together. Because they don't really answer the problem of scale. They don't really answer the problem of resources. The many mechanisms that they give, independent rebuttals already made, are let's say, things that happen long term. Economies of scale, tailored solutions take long times to come. What's probably much more important and immediate is getting that cash flow that we uniquely get and ask for incentive analyze in first and second. So very clearly, we are able to help vulnerable actors such as developing countries who do not have resources, getting far greater cash flow and solve their issues with much more immediacy on our side. But secondarily, in terms of global problems, we show greater propensity of the solution occurring, and if the solution does occur, happening at a larger extent than theirs. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the third negative and indeed all speakers for that debate. I am gonna ask everyone to leave the breakout room now, so that the panel can deliberate or come to their come to their decisions, submit their ballots, then have a discussion, and then we will return once we have finished that.
Thanks, everyone.
Another
Thanks.
round, everyone.
Thank you.